You are listening to Action Design, your monthly insight into the field of behavioral economics and its applications to the world around us. We bring you leading practitioners from all industries to discuss cutting-edge behavioral research and how to practically apply those concepts to the development of consumer products and public policy.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Action Design Radio. I'm your host, Zarak Khan. With me, as always, Erik Johnson. Hi, Erik. How are you?
Hello, Zarak, and hello, everyone. I am doing well, doing very well. It's a beautiful Friday.
It is a beautiful Friday currently. Who knows what day it'll be when you're listening to this.
I hope it's a beautiful day when you're listening to this as well.
We are particularly excited for this episode. Some folks that we've been excited to chat with for a long time and who have a book that just came out that is very interesting, and we're going to kind of talk about a bunch of different aspects of that, the process, content, and all that stuff. So we're excited to have Elspeth Kirkman and Michael Hallsworth join us today. Thank you both for joining. Elspeth, maybe give our listeners just a little glimpse into your sort of backstory, your origin story in becoming a behavioral scientist and your work with Behavioral Insights team that led to this book.
The hero's journey.
Well, yeah, I didn't want to say it, but now that you've characterized it that way, I'll just own it. I joined the Behavioral Insights team which is my current employer, in 2013. So it's about 3 years after it had first formed in British government. And it was a very small team at the time. Before that, I'd done management consulting, working in government, so not necessarily directly relevant, but I had a long-standing interest in human behaviour from my two areas of study. So one was a master's degree in, among other things, design, which is maybe an obvious link. And the other area of study, which the wonderful Michael Hallsworth shares with me, is an English literature undergraduate degree. And I think both of us have found lots of strange similarities between what you learn in an English literature degree and what you study as a behavioural scientist over the years. So even though it seems a little bit detached, it's actually quite formative and useful. And then since being a part of the Behavioural Insights team, I've done a bunch of different jobs. Most recently, I'm actually on a secondment at the moment, but before that, most recently, I ran our health education and local government practices out of London, but I was also the founding head of BIT North America, where Michael's now sitting.
Thank you. And I totally agree on this journey from literature to behavioral science. My background was in history, but I did basically like a combo like literature, history, undergrad. And I think it's great training for a behavioral scientist, or at least a good entry point. Michael,
that sounds like
a
future podcast episode.
Yeah, totally.
Hi everyone. Great to be with you today. So my journey, I think I would say it started when I was working at the Institute for Government, which is a think tank in the UK, and Nudge had not long come out, and we were asked by the government of the day to kind of put together a summary or a how-to guide for applying behavioral science to public policy. And that became the Mindspace report. Not long after the Behavioral Insights team was set up, I went into government to work on trying to get people to pay their tax on time. I spent a couple of years doing that, and then went to do other things formally as part of the team, which then, as you know, was spun out of government to become a separate organization. And 2 years ago, I came over to the US to run BIT North America, as Elspeth just referred to. In terms of kind of the journey, so yeah, I spent some time at the RAND Corporation at the start of my career, thinking about the scientific method and how you can apply it to policy, and then, you know, complemented out, built on that with a PhD later, that basically tried to bring together a lot of the work that I've been doing at BIT. Yeah, and now we try to put all that thinking together in the book that just came out, which we're all really excited about.
Yeah, and the book is called Behavioral Insights, out from MIT Press. And it was interesting because, I mean, it felt to me like it pulled together a number of different sort of elements, and it's I think maybe the third book from like the bit world, maybe fourth. And it's sort of, part of it seemed like a little bit of an introduction to behavioral science and behavioral insights. Part of it's kind of like the history of the field broadly, and then a little bit more specifically, your work, which is of course kind of fundamental in building out and kind of popularizing this. And then a little bit of kind of prognosis, sort of you're kind of looking at where the field might go. So I'm curious, when you were looking at kind of the work that you had done and, what your peers had sort of written and published, who were you thinking of as like the audience for this, and what was kind of the inspiration for writing this?
Absolutely. So it's kind of part of a series called the Essential Knowledge Series, and I think that sums it up. So what we wanted to do was give a kind of succinct overview of what is this idea of behavioral insights, defining it, talking about the history, talking about how it's used and the future. If somebody's heard of the term but doesn't really know what it is, can you just get to the core of it and give a really clear overview of the field? And there are books obviously out there that give lots of kind of stories and focus on one aspect of it, whereas we just kind of wanted to get straight to it, make it entertaining, but imagine that somebody doesn't know anything about it. What are we talking about with this term behavioral insights, and where's it come from? Also, I think it's pretty useful if you're kind of an undergraduate or postgraduate, and you want to get to that information quickly. So we designed it as an overview of the core concepts, but we tried to make it so that it wasn't superficial. It packed enough stuff in, but in a really concise way. That's what we hope we did.
Yeah, I mean, that definitely came through in the book. Like it is concise and you can work through pretty quickly, but it's at the same time very dense. As someone who's been in the field for quite a while, I found like I learned tons of new stuff in it, especially, a couple things like you mentioned, defining behavioral insights. Like that part of the book, I was like, I've used that term behavioral insights for years, but never actually defined what that meant, and just like fundamental things like that are really helpful. And I also really enjoyed kind of the history part of it. So maybe we can dive into the content a little bit. Tell us a little bit like about that definition. So like behavioral insights is a term that's thrown around pretty often, but like I said, I never really thought about what that means really specifically. So how do you define it, and how did that sort of process? Was there any have you encountered different definitions of it or different interpretations, and how'd you go about defining that and coming to sort of an agreement on that?
So interestingly, we did think, do you want to do an introduction to behavioral economics? We felt that was already out there. But behavioral insights is a term that's been used and kind of pretty much came about 10 years ago when I suppose when the team was created, but is sometimes used in quite a vague way. And this has been something we were conscious of in our work. And it was something that been nagging at us because I think the extent to which it's being used requires you to actually define it and say, what does this mean? And I'm going to give a really quick overview of how we define it. It's basically got three parts. The first is that it draws on evidence about behavior, more specifically evidence around the kind of dual process theories of behavior. The second thing is it's practical, it's applied, it's pragmatic, it deals with the real world, with particular problems. It's kind of the applied use of that science. And then the third aspect is it tries to evaluate the effects of the interventions. It doesn't just assume things work. It tries to be skeptical and measure the impact wherever possible in the most kind of robust way. So if you take those three things together, evidence about behavior, the practical focus, and the evaluation, those are the core components.
Erik, to your point on reading it and thinking, gosh, I've never really kind of interrogated this and I've been throwing the term around for ages. You are not alone, my friend. You said you quite wanted to get behind the curtain when we do this interview, but honestly, for me, it was a really fascinating, interesting experience sitting down and writing this, because honestly, very naively, I went into it certainly thinking, oh, we do this stuff day in, day out, so it's really just going to be kind of chronicling and explaining out things that we think about on a day-to-day basis and dabble in all the time. And actually it was a pretty interesting soul-searching exercise to get to the bottom and to bring out something as simple as what Michael just kind of articulated.
to what extent do you think that this was, that it was beneficial to have sort of a vague term in the beginning? Like I think with action design, we've always kind of said like, oh, we are, like behavioral science, and like action design itself is sort of like not really like a term necessarily. I mean, like some people use it in a specific in a specific way, but I've always kind of liked that it allows for like a pretty broad scope and a pretty big tent in terms of inviting people to participate and to join. So, to what extent was it useful for you in the beginning to have this kind of vague term that, allowed you a little bit more latitude in what you might do? And then as it sort of matured, you kind of came to the point where you're like, actually, we need to sort of define this. And Elspeth, maybe I'll throw this to you first.
Sure. I mean, I think you've nailed it already. With the benefits of having a broad church are certainly quite tangible. I think also it's sort of important to note that it is one of the things that I think is really advantageous about the way that certainly we've historically worked on these kinds of problems is that you want a sort of wide lens to be able to look at things through. So you want to be able to bring in insights from sociology, economics, psychology, design, all of those different ways of looking at human behavior. And obviously there's been academic debate for much longer than there's been sort of policy applications or units specifically designed to apply this stuff to policy. And it felt, I think, probably not particularly beneficial in terms of use of time to sort of weigh in with those things. I wasn't there personally when the term behavioral insights was coined and decided upon, but it seems like a very smart move to me for exactly the reasons that you outlined, that it allows you to be quite broad, to explore, to learn, and to sort of define yourself over time, and people don't already have a kind of straw man to critique you on the basis of from the outset.
Well, speaking of having kind of a wide view of things, one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the book is the section on the history of kind of this field, or how it sort of developed. Could you sort of talk us through some of this, like the research that you did and sort of what you decided to include and what you decided to cut out too? There are a couple of things that you sort of give like a nod to where you're like, oh, and behaviorism happened here, and like keep going. So I'm curious as to sort of what that process was like, and it was one of the things, I mean, again, as a history major, one of the things that was kind of the most interesting pieces to me was sort of see how this has developed over time.
Michael's going to answer this question because he wrote that section, but I remember receiving the draft of it and reading we have to go back to the Enlightenment of the 18th century and thinking, do we? Oh God,
essential knowledge, Michael, essential knowledge.
And then he just
that's what piqued my interest. I was like, whoa, we're going way back. This is exciting.
Yeah, he just sort of 1-inch punched the whole thing into a single chapter, and it was brilliant. And I thought, oh God, I've got to send him the draft of my chapter next.
Well, we'll get into that in a minute.
social pressure, we know that works, yeah.
Oh, as you know, chapter 2 is the highlight of the book. Actually, some people read it and they said Elspeth's chapter 4 is the highlight. But we can get to that.
A highly contested topic for sure,
yeah. Yeah. So the history is really interesting to think about, because I feel that there's quite a lot of history out there about behavioral economics. And indeed, Richard Thaler wrote Misbehaving, which is a fantastic book talking about the evolution of behavioral economics. But that's not the whole story here, because we're talking about behavioral economics, but also there's a whole different strand from psychology that takes a different view and doesn't sort of have the emphasis on expected utility theory, and therefore it's not like kind of looking at deviations from a model, but it's just thinking about dual process theory. So I think it was a product of thinking about this stuff for quite a long time that we realized that there were 3 strands going on here. There's the behavioral economics story, there's the kind of dual process psychology theory strand, and then there's the third strand around governments and behavior. And I feel that those 3 things have not really been brought together in the same way. And in fact, what I think we say is that they kind of coincide around the late noughties, if you like, to produce a particular set of conditions that meant this application of behavioral science to government was likely to happen. And so for example, we don't talk about behaviorism too much in it. because it would have required quite a long deviation from that narrative. But at the same time, you don't want to pretend it doesn't happen. So we have to, nod to it and say, of course, behaviorism is like a very interesting part of this. And with the kind of roots in the Enlightenment and the birth of psychology and so on, and we managed to get reference to Hobbes and Leviathan in there from the 17th century.
Don't
the point of
say
that, the point of that, I love a Hobbes reference.
So do I.
The key thing there is just to say that I think there is a tendency in some histories to say 1972, for example, Kahneman Tversky did some experiments. Let's just go from there. But of course, there is a longer history, and we're not going to go through all of it. But I think it's worth trying to just hint at where some of these broader currents came from in the past. And I think you can do that in essential knowledge kind of narrative. And I think it's just interesting to people because a lot of the narratives just don't bother with that. So we wanted to hint at this deeper history as well, and encourage people to go and look at that themselves if they want to.
Yeah, and to your point, like that's why I really enjoyed that chapter, because I've noticed that too, in that a lot of the most interesting sort of behavioral or tangentially behavioral stuff I've read isn't in necessarily traditional behavioral economics or like modern behavioral science. Like there's old psychology books that are really interesting, and even when you read old philosophy and stuff, sometimes there's just like super interesting insights that you can tell are hinting at a lot of the stuff we started defining later on. So I found that really interesting. And I could also see as like a practical guide that the book is, that would be really helpful with someone who's new to the field to kind of really see like how all these things connected and how this grew into what it is. I think that's a really helpful basis.
So I think one really interesting article is by Nava Ashraf, George Lowenstein and Colin Camera, called Adam Smith, Behavioral Economist. And that looks at the importance of his work around the theory of moral sentiments. And the view of human nature you get in that is very different from kind of the Cliff Notes version of The Wealth of Nations. And I think it's great if people can get that grounding in some of the history of the thinking in this area.
So Elspeth, you mentioned receiving this chapter from Michael and then thinking about what you would need to do to sort of, I guess, match it in the chapters that you were writing. You've obviously worked closely together at BIT. I'm curious as to what the experience was like and if it was different collaborating on this book.
Yeah, it was certainly different. I think the mode of work was very different to the sorts of things that we're doing day in, day out at BIT. So Michael and I'd obviously worked together for a lot, but we'd never really kind of co-written anything as far as I can think, apart from we wrote a blog series together which directly preceded this on behavioral science and classic literature and how they kind of intersect, which was a very good kind of entry project and learning curve, I suppose. I think one thing I really enjoyed, and I feel like I got out of this, but I also was then able to sort of apply more to my working style, was I think there's quite a big contrast between the way that Michael writes something and the way that I write something. So I'm very much kind of bang down a first draft, share it very quickly, probably put quite a bit of the work on somebody else to do some reviewing and some thoughtful critique, and then go back to it and try and refine it. Whereas I think Michael is much more disciplined and does kind of sends you a better first draft, basically. And I think that worked well because I think it meant that we probably complemented one another in terms of, having a nice kind of cadence of exchanging articles and doing back and forth feedback and those sorts of things. But it's something where I think I've slightly recalibrated now how scruffy I'll allow my first draft to be before someone sees it. I don't know if you know that, Michael.
Well, we haven't written anything together since. I'm
and we never will.
Drama on the podcast. So shifting a little back towards some of the content of the book, especially in the application aspects of it. One anecdote that I thought was really interesting was when the original kind of UK BIT team was being put together in the government, that you had a really specific pointed plan with incentives and sort of targets to, as you say in the book, to overcome skepticism, because obviously it's a new, whenever you're doing a new innovation kind of thing, there's a lot of skepticism that you need to prove yourself quickly. So could you like talk through that process a little bit, and also like what's that kind of broader lesson for people? Because there's a lot of people probably listen who are working in non-behavioral jobs that, you know, they don't have behavioral science in their title, but they want to do more behavioral science. But, you know, those are the kind of barriers they have to overcome. So maybe talk about that kind of background on that, and, you know, how you see teams or recommend teams start implementing stuff to overcome that kind of initial skepticism.
Sure. So I think one thing to bear in mind here is that some of the people involved in setting up the team had experience in government and kind of knew what it took to survive and to thrive. And so the idea was to set up these goals, partly to sort of say, what are we about? So rather than having a very kind of vague sense of what we're doing, because these techniques, I suppose, could be applied in various different ways, we wanted to be quite specific to answer people's questions. So the first thing was that we were quite small, and we weren't intended to be a massive kind of resource. We're trying to do things at low cost and think very differently. And yeah, we did set up the sunset clause, and this actually is an example of a default. So the idea was that if we hadn't achieved 3 things by our 2nd anniversary, the default is that we would be closed down, because we knew that otherwise organizations have various ways of trying to prolong their existence. And we thought that ultimately we should either try and have an impact, or we should just kind of leave it there. And 2 years seems a fair amount of time. And the 3 things were to, you know, try and transform 2 areas of policy. 2nd, spread an understanding of behavioral approaches across the civil service. And 3rd, achieve at least a 10-fold return on the cost of the team. And just very briefly explain the kind of impact of these. You know, the first one, major areas of policy, meant that we tried to go beyond just tweaking things and say we should also be involved in kind of some of the fundamental decisions around making policy choices, which have traditionally been the domain of kind of economists, you know, still is to a large extent, but how can we bring in behavioral science to that arena? And the second one around spreading it emphasized, you know, the behavioral insights is an approach, not just a collection of ideas you drop in, and try to help people apply that approach. And the third thing about, you know, getting a return on investment was that we sometimes focused on the kind of less glamorous and controversial areas, and tried to look at ones which really made a difference and were valued by administrators, but, you know, were sometimes neglected. And, you know, that meant we looked at things like tax compliance, for example, where there was a lot of money on the table and where you could make a meaningful difference, but wasn't like the really headline challenge facing the country. And yeah, perhaps the biggest thing underlying all this was the emphasis on evaluation. We said, you know, we will know if we have not produced a result. And that was scary, and, you know, continues to be scary, you know, because, you know, going into any project, you may say that this did not have the impact that we wanted. But we figured it was the only way really of overcoming this kind of skepticism, much of which was quite justified. And so those things put together, I think, had a bit of a lasting impact on the way we worked. I'm not sure that they're all the ones that any new team should adopt, but I think people do appreciate the kind of intellectual honesty and the way you put yourself out there by saying, we're going to test it, you're going to find out whether it works. And if it doesn't work, I'm going to come here and tell you that. As you know, in our experience, even if you go there and do that, as both of us have done quite a few times, the reaction is often fairly positive. People value the fact that this particular thing didn't have an impact, but at least we know it. I will caveat that by saying if nothing works at the start, then that is also a problem. So you need an element of luck as well, I think, if I'm honest with you. And we all know hindsight bias. A lot of these stories really neglect the element of luck in them. And so, you know, I think we tried to get the people with the right capabilities, and we tried to set the right kind of goals. We were also quite lucky, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise.
Elspeth, is that your, you know, kind of experience as well, like in setting up BIT North America too?
Absolutely, completely completely resonates. I was tempted to give an answer, which was, it's not luck, it's talent and hard work. But I can't even back it. Yeah, very similar experience. And it was one of the things that we did early on, and Bit North America kind of continues to do, was we were working with a lot of mid-sized cities in the US. And so I think we got really good actually at sort of honing our skills around going in and picking out which projects were likely to be sort of good demonstrator proof of concept ones, what the right trade-offs were, how to get people kind of jazzed and excited about something that might seem a little bit sort of harebrained and different to the usual way of doing things, how to kind of talk about evaluation. It's a lot of fun. I really like doing that part of the job.
That leads us to kind of like another content question, I think, which is, you've talked about, it's interesting to point out the element of luck, which that very much resonates with me as well. Like whenever anyone asks, I was like, I'm like lucky. That's how I describe myself. It's like very lucky. You talk in the book about expanding these tools and this sort of approach to people who aren't experts so that they can use them for their own lives. That's certainly kind of in line with the mission of action design as well. I'm curious, like, when you think about how you have done it with sort of like expertise, but it requires like a lot of sort of luck and sort of environmental, support. What do you see as the opportunities for that with non-experts as well? And maybe Elspeth, I'll start with you again this time.
Yeah, so let me just clarify. Is the question kind of about how to get non-experts doing this stuff, or would I be answering the wrong question if I answer that?
No, I think that's right.
Okay. We've had loads and loads and loads of really good examples, I think, of people who you would consider to be non-experts. Number one, coming up with the very intervention that ends up doing best and being tested and all of those kinds of things. So trumping the experts, I suppose, in terms of intervention design. And number two, continuing to kind of think in this new behavioural way after we've gone in and shared some of the tools and come up with really fantastic ideas and actually sort of evaluate them in the future. So I would say that a lot of people, and particularly people who work on frontline delivery and are constantly kind of thinking about why the individuals they work with do or don't take certain courses of action, they sort of come to this quite intuitively, and giving, a lot of the time, some of the feedback that I'll get, at least from running sessions with those types of practitioners, is, I didn't know there was a name for this thing. I've been doing it often anyway. A good example is my very first project when I joined the Behavioural Insights team actually was working with staff in employment centres in the UK who basically spends their day seeing people and trying to get them back into work and get them connected to jobs and all of those sorts of things. And the sort of insights and intuitions that a lot of those people doing those roles had are basically behavioural insights, just without the fancy titles and the names. And a lot of the way that we ended up designing it was a very kind of complex program of interventions that sort of intersected and sat together for that particular piece of work. But a lot of that was just informed by, what does the best practitioner already do? And what is it about that that's working? And how can we kind of decode it from a behavioural angle? So a lot of the kind of innate observational ability to deconstruct problems in a behavioural way already exists. And so often it's just kind of giving people a vocabulary and walking them through a project a couple of times. Of course, that's not always true. It's a science as well as a sort of art and an intuition. But I think it does, I think we should be more hopeful about how much we can democratize this stuff than often I think we are as a field.
Yeah, that's definitely been my, like I would say, a lesson that I feel like I learned kind of early on was to like try to listen to what other folks have been doing or trying. Maybe they haven't been like evaluating it necessarily, but have like anecdotal evidence of like, I've tried like 50 things because this is my daily job that I'm doing all the time, and these things seem to work better. And I kind of learned sort of early on not to come in with like too many behavioral science terms, because then you kind of almost look like I don't know, like an idiot or like a goofball or something when people are like, oh yeah, well, you can call it whatever you want, but this is what we call it, and we've been doing it for 20 years.
Yeah, and I think like there is a bit of a joke with the ruptures are healing, but sometimes psychologists are definitely like, oh wow, economists have just discovered the way that humans behave in things. Right. And it's this sort of lampooning. I mean, of course I'm talking about behavioral economics rather than behavioral insights at large, but we do have to have some humility about it.
Yeah, definitely.
I was just going to say really quickly that I think this is also part of the broader kind of narrative in the second half of the book, where we want to talk about non-experts using these ideas, because I think there was a kind of overall narrative at the start of, particularly associated with a critique of nudging, that it's a very linear process where there is like a government that does something to a person. And we want to say, well, you can use behavioral science, behavioral insights in many different ways. It can increase people's agency. People can use it to achieve their goals themselves, rather than being something done unto them. And I think, this is some like a kind of a debate in the literature, but I see this as being completely within the scope of behavioral insights, just applied in a different way. Of course, what I'm not saying is that all you have to do is try to get people to think differently and all the problems will be solved, because many of those problems are structural. And again, no one is neglecting that. And in fact, towards the end of the book, we talk about how people can use this way of thinking to organize and produce political or social change themselves. And I think that's a really important narrative, and one in which we should be thinking more about it and how things can evolve.
Yeah, that's really interesting framing to it. And it's almost like, in one sense, at the sort of higher level, like BIT type of work, you can use behavioral insights to remove some of those structural barriers or make things easier for people. But then the flip side, you can also use them for individuals that, whatever their situation is, to kind of maximize that situation and maximize their output and their goals and that kind of thing. And those are not at all incongruent with each other, because we can work on an individual level, use behavioral insights to kind of help achieve towards goals. And then at a higher level, those of us that have the opportunity to work on actually improving those systems that are creating the barriers in the first place, if we get those things combined, really make a much bigger difference at, kind of society at large.
So one of the things that I was kind of wondering is, this is essential knowledge. What's the knowledge that's like just barely non-essential? Like, as you were putting this together, you're like, oh man, if we had one more chapter, or if I had like 3 more paragraphs in each chapter, like what was the stuff that you were like, man, I really wish we could have gotten to this, but we didn't?
I mean, I frequently had 3 more paragraphs than were allowed. But what did we leave on the cutting room floor? There was a temptation, I think, and the reason this didn't make the cut is not because it's not important, but because it's just not quite closely enough related to the core. But some of the deeper discussion points around, what are RCTs useful for? What do they actually tell you? What are their limitations? Some of that sort of, Angus Deaton critiquing stuff would have been extremely interesting to explore, but number 1 would have probably taken us down too much of a technical rabbit hole. And number 2 is just not quite closely enough aligned. So that's maybe for a different book, for a different time. And I think we probably would have wanted to say more about, Michael was just talking about the sort of systemic aspects of a lot of these problems. We would have wanted to go, if we'd had more space, into more detail on systems thinking and how that might intersect, and maybe some things around scaling and implementation science, and why things don't why things don't always translate out of the initial setting in which they were tested. But again, those are topics for different Essential Knowledge series books, I think.
Yeah, I think there are things that we could have done in more depth. I think we at least referred to most of the things that we thought were important. So we don't go into enormous depth around some of the frameworks, for example. We figured that we would give examples and we would talk about different concepts, but it's very difficult to give a comprehensive account of all the different concepts involved. So we kind of parked it because it would become unwieldy. And we do a brief tour and then point people in other areas. And that was just a strategic decision to keep it manageable. And many things we point people to are kind of publicly and freely available, because we want people to use this practically. I think one thing which we come back to a few times in the book is this idea that behavioral insights incorporates different aspects of behavioral science, and it's not just a technique that is applied to people. And what I mean by that is there are various arguments and debates in the academic literature. For example, between like Gerd Gigerenzer, Daniel Kahneman, very different views of the world, and people who take these kind of two different views, one of which is, more around nudging, for example, and the other which is more around, say, boosting or helping people do things themselves. And one thing we've always found a bit strange and a bit frustrating is that from an applied sense, we don't really care about the debates. What we care about is it likely to work in this particular instance? And so in some instances, you may focus on a kind of giving people better heuristics to make decisions. And there are some really nice examples of that. But in other cases, you want to take the other approach. The fact that there is an academic debate about this doesn't really matter to us because we want to talk about the applied stuff. Both of the views kind of fall within this idea of behavioral science. And I think people tend to get a bit obsessed with those debates. And in fact, we're just sitting here going, well, they're not particularly, I don't really mind if there is this argument. What can we take from both sides?
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. It's funny, I am doing like a sort of intro to behavioral science talk in like a couple of weeks. And I haven't done just sort of like a general talk in a really long time. I don't know, like I feel like once you start doing like a specific industry or specific application, you end up like developing kind of content and thinking around that. And I realized like, man, I haven't done just sort of like a 101 in a really long time. And I look back at the last one that I had done, and it was like very heavy on nudging and cognition. And, my like understanding of behavioral science and application of behavioral science is much more expansive now than it was when I sort of first, because my entry point was behavioral economics. And so, yeah, I kind of had to totally redo this to include sort of both of what the aspects that you just described. Because, yeah, I agree, like to a practitioner, it doesn't really matter as much other than just sort of understanding like these are all the things that are available and not necessarily like, well, this, like the epistemological debates, I guess, about like what sort of what to use when or where, but thinking more of like these are all things that you could sort of bring to bear on a problem, whether that's sort of like a nudge on a web page or whether it's something that's more like increasing someone's motivation or something to take on the task in the first place. That is something that I think is interesting to dive into, and yeah, maybe the next book that you all write.
One thing I find, just to have a mini rant for a second.
Oh, please.
One thing I find slightly annoying is this idea of, well, I say it's annoying, but I find it a little bit tedious sometimes when there are endless debates about the exact definition of a nudge, yes, for example. Now, that's not because I don't fundamentally care or I'm somehow not interested in kind of the theory of it. We've written stuff in academic journals to try and address these issues. It, for me, it's not the fundamental question. So, for example, I believe someone's written their I think master's thesis on how what the nudge unit did. They weren't nudges, and I think, from my perspective, that's kind of doubly wrong. One, because we didn't call ourselves the nudge unit because that is one aspect, really interesting, important one, but only one aspect of applied behavioral science. And two, we didn't claim. So what? In a sense, like I don't really care if they are or not. Was there a tangible, reliable impact on outcomes in the real world? That's what I care about. The exact definitions and debates around that I find less important for some of the reasons I said earlier about, what we care about is applying the stuff in practice. I do think sometimes there is a concern that comes about when people really misuse the term nudge, and we talk about that a bit in the book. My concern there is kind of a different one in that people use it as a kind of shortcut to get some kind of credibility for the thing they're talking about. And if everyone does that, but in fact what they're proposing is not very reliable, the concept loses credibility in the end. It's like a tragedy of the commons. But yeah, I just find those kind of debates missing the point sometimes.
Yeah, I've seen it. I mean, I think there's sort of two things that are kind of primarily like feeding this. I mean, one is sort of on the academic side. I think like as I've like learned more and more about academia, like I think, that's part of how people build careers is sort of like you establish some really kind of groundbreaking thing, and then you sort of, in a lot of cases, do sort of like variations on a theme of that, but it becomes like a lens for how you sort of, it becomes like the hammer that you like, and every problem's a nail, or what, the other way around. The other thing is that, to your other point is that, yeah, I see people like practitioners or sort of like would-be practitioners kind of use it as like sort of a signaling thing too, to say like, oh, this is what it's almost like branding for themselves too. And when like the branding becomes more important than like actually like moving the needle on whatever the outcome is that you're supposed to be working on, then that's sort of a big problem, I think. So these are all interesting things to kind of think about, and for the next book or article, I'm curious, like for what you've written here, like what you're hoping people will take from this. You've talked a little bit about the audience for it, but what's your hope that people will do with this essential knowledge?
I hope that they will use it to make the world a better place, if I may. That is actually a serious thing that I would like people to do. I would like for people to feel like a potentially complex or intimidating topic has been unpacked and demystified for them. I would like people to retain a little bit more clarity about some of the things that we've just talked about in terms of what do these different terms mean, how do you kind of apply them, again, not in a sort of particularly forensic academic way, but in a let's make sure that this is useful and it's driving impact, rather than just a cipher that nobody really kind of understands the meaning under the hood of. And I hope that people will, tell their friends that this is a fantastic book and they should all buy it and read it. Maybe it's a stocking filler.
It is quite an interesting shape, isn't it, Elspeth? It's kind of smaller. So
perfect for a friend with a handbag.
Yeah, it's very portable. You could put it in a stocking quite easily. Yeah, so I hope people put it in their stockings, obviously. I am really hoping that people read it and kind of think, oh, finally, I get it. There is something here, and it does make sense. And I now understand what people were talking about, and it provides some clarity there. In an ideal world, what people can also do is, I hope, think about how they can reconsider some of the challenges they're facing with these ideas. And it may not get them all the way, but one of the chapters does try and take you through how you might approach a problem. And that was great work by Elspeth putting that together. There are many guides out there. They actually have some common phases, and we didn't want to promote one or the other. So we just tried to put together, how do you go from a big amorphous problem to something that you actually can do? And there are guiding people through those stages. So I might hope that people might be able to do that themselves and see a path through what looks like a kind of impenetrable forest to them at the moment.
Well, it is a fantastic book, and I definitely suggest people buying it for themselves or for their friends, family, loved ones, for their stockings or any other gift-giving occasion. I know you do have an acknowledgement section in here, but is there anyone that you guys want to give a shout out to for either help with the book or support for anything? The answer can be no. No.
I'm just thinking
or it could
that...
be a spoiler, like no.
It's a bit like a wedding speech now, because you asked us, and if we miss someone out, it could be really
You're
awkward.
right. Yeah, that's maybe too tricky of a question.
I was just thinking that I'll do what I've done in the book, which is thank my wife and infant daughter, knowing full well that they will never read the acknowledgement or listen to this podcast. So thank you for being a wonderful distraction by not really caring that much about this particular endeavour.
Yeah, exactly. I'd also like to thank my wife and daughter for the same reasons, and they also won't listen to this. So that's
those are great answers. So, of course, where can people acquire this book, and where else should they go for anything that you would like them to check out? Where should they follow you or look for your work or anything else you'd like to point them towards?
They can buy this book anywhere that they buy their books normally. Don't promote your local bookstore or wherever. You can go to bi.team for the team Behavioral Insights team's website, and I feel I should also say that I did end up creating my own website for this opportunity. I felt I was struggling with myself between is this kind of really awkward? And in the end, I just went on Squarespace and did it like an evening, and there it is now. So you can go there. It's great. It's myname.com.
Okay. I'm guessing that means michaelhallsworth.com.
Yeah, I mean, if I actually bought myname.com, I imagine it would cost quite a bit. Yeah.
Cool. How about you, Elspeth?
I have not got my act together and got a website. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at Carminka. And Michael, I think, covered the rest of it.
Fantastic. Well, thank you both for joining. Really enjoyed the conversation, really enjoyed the book, and I look forward to chatting with you again soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening. That concludes this edition of Action Design Radio, hosted by Eric Johnson and Zarak Khan. All podcast episodes are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and many other platforms where you might typically get your pod on. And don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter. Special thanks to Morgan Bortz for design, and as always, we would like to recognize Steve Wendell, founder of the Action Design Network, a nonprofit organization dedicated to spreading awareness about behavioral economics, psychology, and all things behavioral science in order to help you improve your life, your career, and your understanding of the world around us and the people in it. I am your producer and audio engineer, Zach Simon. For more cutting-edge behavioral science content, visit action-design.org. Once again, that's action-design.org. There, you can sign up for our newsletter and find an in-person event happening near you. We have chapters in over a dozen cities in the United States and Canada. Also, on our website, you can find additional notes and links regarding the topics discussed in today's episode. Thank you again for tuning in, and we will see you again soon.